Hey everybody, welcome back to World History with Mr. Finn. We are in the Americas. You have looked at some different Native American tribes that were in North America. Now we're going to move to something called Mesoamerica. Today would be considered, Latin America, or it might be considered Central America. Those are all terms for it, but it would include areas of modern-day Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, things like that. The modern-day country names we don't need to know so much. You do, but not for our purposes. So, what we're looking at and why we're jumping to them is because these are going to be larger scale actual civilizations. As I said, the cultures of the Native American groups in North America were spread out all over, as you've seen from the last assignment, depending on kind of where you were. And they were smaller groups, and some were hunter and gatherers, some were like the mound builders, some were living in modern day Arizona in the Anasazi. So with all of those different groups, based on climate, they're going to exist in North America, and there are a variety of them, thousands of different groups of Native Americans. When we get down into Mesoamerica, as we are calling it, we start to see Native American groups that are now going to stand pat, stay still. They're going to grow. They're going to have civilizations that rival the civilizations that we've looked at with different groups in Europe. And in Asia, in India and things like that. So these are the tribes, the groups, the Native Americans that really speak to our world history class of looking at these civilizations and what comes out of them. And to jump into it, just to give you a few, we are going to have a quiz. So I'm going to try and get through some of these earlier groups so that next time we can get into the meeting really of Europe and America coming together. But first, let's take a look at what were these groups about. So as we are going to look in this area, we start to see different groups. These are tribes that are going to be different, empires, really, civilizations like the Olmec, the Maya, and the Toltec. So these are, as a group, these are different Native American empires. So they're not tribes, clans, or groups such as the Native Americans in North America. We are now looking at empires. And what is an empire? An empire means that they are going to have a large-scale city, civilization with crops. They're going to have their own unique writing systems, and all of that goes into an empire. A lot of Native American groups in North America didn't have writing systems. It was all stories. Everything was done orally, and there wasn't a record left of the history of those groups. Whereas we start to see writing systems coming out of these groups, so we do have a record of what was going on. They are similar to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, if you remember, used hieroglyphics, glyphic writing. Just to have it here, just so you can see. Glyphic, I think that's how you spell it. Glyphic, yep. Is pictures, really pictures that mean words. It's the best way to put it. So hieroglyphics and glyphic writing in general are, pictures that signify something, and you can read through these glyphic writings. And so you have a history of these groups. Now, what is also important to understand, they are different groups, but something on top of that is that we are going to see this happen, and this happens all throughout our class. All of these groups rise and fall. So they're at different times or different areas. And when I say rise and fall, I'm talking about empires. We're talking about time periods that vary from, 300 to, 800 years. For example, the Toltecs was like a 300-year empire. It grows, and that's a long period of time. So, you're growing over this period of time, and then you fall. Now, why do you fall? There's a variety of reasons for these groups. Let's talk, before we talk about the fall of these groups, let's talk about some of the stuff. One, they use glyphic writing. Two, they have a solid understanding of math. In fact, using zero, which is that sounds funny to you and I, the idea of like, hey, you know what zero is, but zero is, you need to know the concept of zero in order to do like high level mathematics. So just trust me on that one. So the idea that they are advanced in mathematics is excellent for them. Another feather in their cap. Another thing that they do, they create a calendar. And again, yes, I understand that we have calendars and we understand math and all of those things, but the fact is, when you have an empire or groups that are developing these things, that this is a sign of how advanced they are. And so the fact that they have math and they have a calendar, they also are into astronomy. Astronomy is really it's the study of the sky, but like an understanding of like space and like planets. Now, not the same that like we have an understanding of it, but the idea is they can use astrological, measurements and look at, see, what's going on around them in space. So they're big into all these things. Again, just showing higher level thinking and the fact that these are not just groups of people moving from place to place, just trying to survive, but they are now creating large scale cities. In fact, let's take a look at them. There's a couple. One is Teotihuacan, another one is Tikal. And now here's another idea, another thing to show you that we're dealing with more advanced civilizations, advanced Native American civilizations. These cities are going to be up there in the range of 100,000 people. So 100,000 people living in one spot, as we've talked about before, you are going to have, city planning. There's going to be large-scale pyramids and architecture. We are now looking at a city. To say it very simply, there is a city. They are coordinated. They have leadership. They're going to be these groups will be ruled by what we would consider a god king. So the person in charge would have been, in their mind, like a god, basically. So there's someone that has absolute power, but they also have people who take care of things and report back to them. And so you have city planning, you have a government that's running, you have food supplies, you have all of this stuff that you would find in any of the civilizations that we've looked at. So they would have their distinct languages and everything, writing system. So we are now in these earlier phases of the Mesoamerican groups of the Olmec, Mayan, and Toltec, that these are big, advanced civilizations that are existing. Now, here's another important thing to understand. All of them will fall before Europeans, get here. So this is not, we don't have record of these groups from, historical context of like Europeans who came here, wrote down things and observed what they did. We have their records from them. But it's important to understand that when the Europeans do get here, these groups have already risen and fallen over the period of, 300 AD to 900 AD. During that time period. Olmec's come a little bit earlier than that. The time is not, that's not as important. But it is important to understand that these are going to rise and fall. But now why? That is something that we really don't know as much of. Because obviously if your civilization collapses, no one's sitting there going like, yeah, this is why we collapsed. But we do have some records. For example, most of the things that we think happened during this time period is going to be when we have a lack of water. A lack of water. Drought. Lack of water is a death sentence to a civilization. You need water, fresh water. So if there is a drought or a season where not as much rain falls, that affects your crops and how much food you have. It affects the, the water consumption. Like, is there any water to drink? And what happens is, and what we think happens, because again, we don't know for sure, but what history and historians believe happened is, you get a couple of these seasons in a row where there's not as much rain, and all of a sudden people are like, listen, we can't live in these large, we need to go and find, how are we going to live? So if you don't have food and water, smaller groups will chip away from these large civilizations. So you have like 100,000 people, but they kind of disperse is the word. Like, they all go their separate ways. Me and 300 people are going this direction. You and 1,000 people are going that direction. We're all just every man for themselves. We're trying to figure out how can we survive. We'll operate better in a smaller group. And this is the way history does work, is when there is a catastrophe or difficult times, we shrink. The smaller the better. You can't have large scale things because you just can't maintain it. But you can maintain a group of 100. And so the 100 of us are going to band together and we're going to figure this out, and we're going to get smaller in numbers. And that's generally what we believe happens to these groups. At some point, you will have, drought, and you will not have water. You'll not have enough crops. The city will not be able to function correctly, and people will kind of just disperse and go, whatever way they can. Also, warfare. There is constant warfare going on. Again, with all of these different groups, even in North America as well, war was fairly constant. Different groups, different cultures, different ways of doing things would not, mesh. And so you would see that as well. So what we will get to moving forward is going to be, the coming together of Europe and these Native American groups. But that is going to be, again, the Aztec when we get to it. Now, I said we have a quiz, 1 through 5. I'm trying to get it all into here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm not in front of a desk with a book, so I had to go and pick out questions for you already. So these are pre-picked questions today, not random. Well, they were random. I looked through the book. So number 1, let's get to it. Number 1, this is the term for the bubonic plague that hit Europe in the 1300s. What do we call that bubonic plague? It has a very ominous or scary name for number 1. I'm just going to go ahead because you can pause and fill these in. Number 2. Number 2 is a crime against the church was called what? You could be one of these as well. If you committed a crime against the church or a crime against the church, what is that for number 2? There's a term for that. Number 3. Number 3 goes to our guild systems. Now, if you remember, you could be an apprentice and a journeyman. You finally become a master. But in order to become a master, you had to create what? What did you have to create to make that final jump to become a master in the guild system? Number 4. Number 4 was a very ambitious man. He was an emperor in the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, and he had a dream to reconquer the old entire Roman Empire. And he did a very good job of it and really kind of got most of that land back. However, it was really expensive and it was a waste, and there really wasn't a point to have all of that again. But what was that emperor's name who did want to reconquer and recreate the Roman Empire? And the final one is in feudalism, we had a lord and we had a vassal, and the lord would give land to the vassal. But what was the land called? It was not just land, it had a name. It was a blank. What was it that the lord would give the vassal? The land was called a what? So get that to me today for attendance and participation purposes. You guys have been doing great on quizzes, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. I'm expecting some good scores here. But yeah, get that to me today for attendance and participation purposes, and I will see you next class.